Hi, everyone. I am your host, Michael Hinkson, or you can call me Mike. It's okay. And this is Unstoppable Mindset, where inclusion, diversity, and the unexpected meet. Today, we're going to do a little bit of all. We're inclusive because my guest, Kane Brolin, or if you're from Sweden, it's Brolin, and it's pronounced Brolin, not Brolin, but Kane Brolin or Brolin is in Indiana. And Kane also happens to be blind and has been blind his entire life. We'll get into that. He is very much involved in investing and dealing with money matters that I'm interested to get a chance to really chat about. It's always fun to talk to people about how they're helping people with finances and money and getting insights. And I'm sure that he has some to offer. So we'll get to that. Kane also happens to be the president of the National Federation of the Blind of Indiana. And so that keeps him busy. So he deals with money and he's a politician to boot. So what else can you ask for? Oh, I pick on Kane by doing that. But nevertheless, Kane, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. And there are times when the politics and the money issues can be a dream. There are other times it can be an absolute nightmare. Either one or both. And the thing that ties those together in common ground is that I walk in the morning and sometimes I have no idea what I'm about to walk into. So It does make for an adventure.
Well, the Fed has lowered interest rates. What do you think about that?
Well, there is some ramification for what happens in the consumer marketplace. The main thing that I've been hearing today is that even with those lowering of short-term interest rates, you're seeing some long-term interest rates go down, the mortgage rates especially. And those two are not necessarily always related. You don't always see the long-term interest rates that the market determines through supply and demand. They don't always go in sync with the short-term baseline rate that the Federal Reserve banking system sets. But in this particular case, they are. And what I've been reading this morning is that may be at least good news in the short run for consumers, because they'll be paying lower interest for new mortgages and also perhaps lower credit card rates or credit card payments. Of course, the downside is that if one invests and is lending money instead of borrowing it, that means sometimes lower rates of income that you can get from things like a certificate of deposit or an annuity. So there's always two sides of the same coin, and it depends on which side you happen to be looking at the moment. Right now, the market seems to like this convergence of interest rate activities, and the stock market has generally been up today. So by the time people hear this, that won't matter because it's a whole different day. But right now, the early returns coming in are pretty good for the common human being out there trying to just manage their money.
Well, and that's not really surprising in a sense, because rates have been high for a while and things have been tough. So it's not surprising that people have made, and I would put it this way to a degree, the marketing decision to respond favorably to the rates going down. And I know there's been a lot of pressure for the Fed to lower its rate, and so they did. And I think that a lot of different entities kind of had to respond in a reasonably positive way, because they kept saying that it's time that the rates go down. So they had to respond. So we'll see how it all goes. I think,
and there's an issue I think that's salient to people with disabilities, blind people included. If it's less expensive for the consumer to borrow money, it should follow that in the coming weeks, it should be less expensive for businesses to borrow money if they need some, and they may be more inclined to open up more jobs to people, or to not shrink the jobs or the hiring that they have done by laying people off. So,
and that's what I was just about.
Don't want is a recession, and so it may mean that there are openings. There's room in the job market for more of us, because the thing I'm most passionate about in this whole game of helping blind people is getting us access to money and getting us access to gainful, permanent work.
And that's what I was actually gonna talk about, or not talk about a long time, but mention was that the real test will be how it affects the job market and the unemployment rate and so on. And I hope that that will go down. I know it's been sort of ticking up a little bit, although in reality, of course, for persons with disabilities, the unemployment rate is a whole lot higher than around 4%. So it'll be interesting to see how all that goes all the way around. But even just the national unemployment rate, I would hope that if that has been an excuse because the rates have been high, that now we'll see that start to drop. And
Right.
well, so we'll see. But I think it's going to be one of those waiting games to see how the world responds. Of course, we have a whole political thing going on with the election, and I'm sure that some people on the political side like the drop better than people on the other side do. But again, we'll see how it all goes. So it makes life fun. Well, tell me a little bit about you, if you would, sort of maybe the early Kane, growing up and all that sort of stuff. You were born, according to your bio, back in 1965. So I was 15 at the time. So I remember the year. So you've been around a little while, though, however. So tell us a little bit about the early Kane.
Yeah, I don't remember too many years or any years really prior to about maybe 1971 or 72 with any degree of real clarity. I would say that my early years were a mixed bag, but in the main, they were good. Of course, being immediately confronted with RLF, or retinopathy of prematurity, as they call it these days, and being blind from the very beginning, most people would probably out there consider it a tragedy. But if I knew that it was my fate to be a blind person, which I suppose it is, then I won the lottery as being a blind person, I think. And that might be a controversial statement, but the truth is that there is no place in the United States, and probably no place in the world, that would have been better for me to grow up in the late 1960s and 1970s than in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
Because now there was no other blindness in my family. It's not hereditary. My parents had no idea how to deal with it in the very beginning.
Were you born prematurely?
I was.
Yeah, which is,
and so I weighed
you have that.
something like 2 pounds, 10 ounces at birth. So there is a part of me that realizes that I am very fortunate to be alive, and I'm very fortunate that my brain has functioned pretty well for most of my life. You can't always count on that either, and when you get older. My father was a very bright person, and yet he lived during the last 10 years of his life. He struggled with dementia and some other problems. So, but I can say that I've had a good run so far. And, what they didn't know, at least my parents and others in my family knew what they didn't know. And when you don't know what you don't know, you flounder and settle for almost anything. Including fear. But when you know what you don't know, then you understand you need to research things. And I happened to be in a state that had been graced by the presence of Dr. Kenneth Jernigan, principally, and of course other people that I had no idea who they were at that time. Folks like James Gashel and James Omvig,
right.
and others. I think Joanne Wilson came out of that mix. I didn't know her either, but I've read about all these people in the past. But first and foremost, my parents found out that Dr. Jernigan was, number one, very brilliant. Number two, did not settle for low expectations, and number three, had the advantage of being both the head of the Iowa Commission for the Blind, which was a state sanctioned agency, and the National Federation of the Blind, which is, or has been for most of the last 84 years, the leading advocacy organization and civil rights organization of the blind in the United States. Now, I'm not here to make a political point about that, but in Iowa, they were definitely more well known than anyone was, and because he could pull strings which influenced things like educational budgets. And he also had very much a civil rights mindset and an aggressive mindset of going forward and breaking down barriers. This is a rare combo platter of traits and possibilities that I very much benefited from. And when I say that, I mean that from the very beginning, at 5 or 6 years old, I had Braille. I didn't have Braille in the beginning, but my parents did, and my dad actually knew enough about it to construct a set of blocks with print lettering on one side, Braille on the other side. And so not only did I have a really good teacher in my first couple of years of public school education named Doris Willoughby. Some may be familiar with her.
I know Doris well.
RIP. She has passed on in the past couple of years, but she made a great impact in my life and a very deep impact in others' lives too. But because of her influence and like-minded people, I had access to books. I had access to mostly mainstreamed integrated education where I was in the classroom with other sighted students, except for certain parts of certain days. I had access to a great big wall-mounted tactile map that was like a puzzle. And I understand Dr. Jernigan designed that one too, where I could actually feel and take apart the states of the Union. And so I could tell where Oklahoma was, where Massachusetts was, where Indiana is. I could tell the shapes of the various states. I thought it was kind of curious that California, where you are from, Michael, is shaped very much like a banana, or at least that's what occurred to me at that time. I had recorded books. I had talking books. And, while there are things I did not get out of a mainstream public education that I kind of wish I had gotten out of it, from a social standpoint, from an athletic standpoint, the academics were on point, and I had access to resources, and I kind of just was living in a dream world in a way, because even through my college days, I thought, well, gee, it's great that we have all this now. Why is there all this blind civil rights stuff going on now? Because this was solved from the beginning of my childhood. Little did I realize that that is not the case in most other parts of the country or the world. But I got what I needed to at least have a shot on goal at success. And I'm very grateful for that. And it's one of the reasons that I have chosen to dedicate a portion of my life during my prime working years even to the National Federation of the Blind, because I want to pay this forward and help out some people that may not have had all the advantages that I had even in the bygone days that I was growing up.
Sure. So tell me, because I went through some of the same experiences you did in terms of being born premature and becoming blind due to RLF, which stands for retrolenteral fibroplasia. And if people want to know how to spell that, they can go by Thunderdog, the story of a blind man, his guide dog, and the triumph of trust at ground zero, and you can learn how to spell it there, because I don't remember how to spell it. We put it in the book, but that's what I remember. But so when it was discovered that you were blind, how did your parents handle that? What did they say? What did the doctors say to them? Because my experience was, and of course I didn't know it at the time, but my parents told me later that the doctors said, send him off to a home because he could never amount to anything, because no blind child could ever contribute to society. If from your understanding from your parents, what happened to you?
If any doctor ever said that to them, they never told me about it. What I do know is that there is an eye doctor that was a part of their lives, who I saw a couple of times probably in my childhood, who was a female optometrist or maybe an ophthalmologist in the area, and they really had a lot of respect for her. I never felt marginalized or dismissed.
Yeah.
As a part of my childhood. Part of it is that I don't think my parents would have tolerated that.
And my parents didn't either. And my parents didn't either. They said, no, you're wrong. He can grow up to do whatever he wants, and we're going to give him that opportunity. And they brought me up that way, which is, of course, part of what led to my psyche being what it is. And I, too, believe in paying it forward and doing work to try to educate people about blindness and so on, and supporting and I've been involved with the National Federation of the Blind since 1972. So it's been a while.
Yeah, I would say I remember I have a very, very fuzzy memory of being 4 or maybe 5 years old, and I know that they considered putting me into the Iowa Braille and Sight Saving School, which was a school for the blind in Iowa. It no longer exists, by the way. But they did consider it and decided against it. I don't think they wanted me to just go off to boarding school when I was 5. I know that does work for some people. And I know that in later years, I've read that in some cases, even Dr. Jernigan believed that schools for the blind were better, especially in places where there wasn't a truly sincere effort by public school systems to integrate and set high expectations for blind students.
Well, of course, here in California, for example, in the 50s and so on, at the California School for the Blind, we had, and earlier, Dr. Newell Perry, among others, who was a blind mathematician. Of course, Dr. Tenbrook was out here. And there were values and reasons why the schools could make a difference. My parents were pushed really hard by my elementary school principal to send me off to that school. And I actually remember hearing shouting matches between them because my parents said, and I didn't go to the school. I don't know what it was like by the time we moved out here, and we were putting me in kindergarten, first and second grade. So like in 56, 57, I'm not sure what the school was like, but my parents didn't want me to not have a real home environment. So,
Yeah. And so, I remember my childhood as well, it wasn't like everybody else's childhood. One of the issues happened to be that the neighborhood that my family lived in did not have a lot of kids in it that were my age for most of the time I was there. The schools in the early to mid 70s, at least, that admitted blind students in the town that I grew up in, which was Cedar Rapids, Iowa.
Okay.
There was only one set of schools on the opposite side of town where they were sending blind kids for those resources. Now that later changed, and the decision was made. I guess I made the decision to stay out there. So one of the differences was that I was bused from the southeast side of town to the southwest side of town.
Yeah.
So there were kids I got to know through school, but I didn't have any kind of social life with most of them, with a couple different exceptions through my childhood. So it was a lot of academics. It wasn't a lot of playtime.
Right.
That certainly informed how I grew up. And it's made me a little bit struggle to understand and be a really sensitive, playful, patient type parent, because my kids, and we'll go there when we get there, but my children, I have 4, they're all still in the home right now, are very normal, kind of rambunctious kids that enjoy and struggle with the same things that any other kids do. They are all sighted. But my parents were both pretty strict. They set high expectations, but some of that was high expectations for behavior as well. So I really wasn't ramming around and causing trouble and getting into mischief and, getting on my bike and riding for miles outside the way kids did in the 70s. So there were limitations in my childhood, but my parents too expected me to utilize and to have the resources that would lead me to be anything I wanted to be. And I honestly think that if I had said, I want to be the president of the United States, they would not have ruled it out. Now, the only thing I've really been president of is several different civic organizations, right, and the Indiana branch of the NFB. That's something not everyone does. I've interviewed a governor before when I was a journalism student. That was fun. And I've met Congress people. But they did not set the limitations. Sometimes maybe I did, but they didn't. And so I'm really grateful for that as long as I knew what I wanted, they made sure that I had the tools and access to whatever training they knew about that could help me to get there.
So you went through school, and I think our younger lives were fairly similar, because I also, when I went into fourth grade and we finally had a resource teacher in the area, I was bused to the other side of town for that. And all of that kind of came together when I started high school, because everyone in Palmdale went to the same high school. So anyone I knew prior to going across town, I got to know again, and still knew as friends growing up, but we all went to high school together. But, I hear exactly what you're saying. And my parents did not impose limitations either, and I'm very blessed for that. But you went through school and then you went to college. Tell me about college.
It was a fun experience. Glad that I went through it. I attended Iowa State University for my bachelor's degree. I know that you've never, ever heard this before, but I really dreamed about being a radio personality. And I say that sarcastically. It's what I wanted to be because I had a cousin that was in the business. But of course, since then, as I've gotten more into blindness culture and met many other people that I never knew growing up, I know that the media, and especially radio as a gift, is really fascinating to many of us, and a lot of us have had rotations in different parts of that, especially with the advent of the internet.
Mm-hmm.
But this was back during the 70s and 80s, and what I wanted to be at first was a DJ. Used to pretend to be one at home all the time, but I also knew where the library was, and I developed a great love of books and information and data to some degree. I wasn't really a math guy, more of a word guy. But I then developed a deep interest in journalism and investigation and research. And so by the middle to late 80s, what I wanted to be was, let's just call it the next Peter Jennings, if one can remember who that is, right? And I'm sure that there are probably, facsimiles of him today. But
it's hard to be a facsimile of Peter Jennings, but I hear you.
It really is, isn't it? He was great. The disadvantage, the advantage and the disadvantage of going to Iowa State University. Why did I go there? Because any of my few relatives that had gone to college, including my dad, had gone there. My dad was very loyal to his alma mater, and he told both myself and my sister, who was a very different person and not blind at all, if it was good enough for me, it's good enough for you. And if you want me to pay for it, here's where you're going to go. Now, Iowa State is mostly an engineering and agricultural school. It's a land grant institution, and I know that land grant institutions are a little controversial in today's climate, where there is more of an emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, and making up for some past societal wrongs. But these are deeply respected institutions that mainly turned out people that ended up, doing things like building bridges and being mechanical engineers and developing new seed corn hybrids and things of this nature. It did have a telecommunicative arts program, and I was in it, but there were very few of us in it. And I did get a chance to get my hands on the equipment. I was a broadcaster first on a student radio station at Iowa State called KUSR. Then I actually did work for pay, sort of, for a number of years for WOI AM and FM, which were flagship stations of what we would now call the NPR network. Mm-hmm. These were around since the 20s, and I actually did work for them. I was on air a little bit. I ran the control board a lot, and I worked for those two stations on a part-time basis, probably about a three-quarter-time basis, for several years after leaving college. And it was really a student job, but I had trouble finding any other more meaningful work in the industry. What I gradually came to find out is that I loved radio, but radio really didn't love me. And I wasn't really thinking strategically at that time. I graduated in 1988. It is that very same year that a little known figure from Kansas City named Rush Limbaugh hit the American airwaves like a ton of bricks. And because of him and some other people like him, all of a sudden local stations realized that they could drop their news and information programming, stop hiring so many people. And because Mr. Limbaugh was as popular as he was, they could basically run a lot of satellite-based programming, have somebody sort of halfway monitor the board and hire somebody else to program computer systems that would put automated commercial breaks on and things like this. And they wouldn't really have to produce local content. We also saw the elimination of the equal time standard and the fairness doctrine, which required local stations to put on a variety of viewpoints and air programming every week that was in the public interest that didn't necessarily have commercial value. And so the things I wanted to do became a lot harder to do because by the time I was ready to get hired to do them, not a lot of radio stations were hiring people to do it,
Right.
even in the television world. And so strategically, I was buying into a sinking market, and that wasn't a great place to be at that time. And so with some reluctance, after a lot of fruitless job searching, I chose another path, not necessarily knowing where that path would lead. And so the last time I ever got paid to run a shift for a radio station was in late June of 1993. I've been a guest on a couple of different shows and some podcasts like this one. I greatly enjoy it. I've even thought about doing some internet broadcasting. I don't have the time really to do that now. I'm sorry, but I miss it. But I have found out there are ways of diverting the skill sets I have to another path. And
so what path did you choose?
Initially, the path I chose was graduate school. I was fortunate enough to have gotten good enough grades that I was able to get approved by a number of different business schools. The first path I really wanted to do was be a foreign service officer for the diplomatic corps. I applied for the U.S. Department of State. And I had some hopes in doing that because around 1990, a gentleman named Rami Rabi, you may know him.
I did.
Became the first blind person ever to be a foreign service officer. Now, he had advantages. He had traveled the world. I had traveled to Mexico and Costa Rica, and I spoke Spanish, and I was pretty fluent. But he was a little bit more qualified in different ways that they were looking for. So I wanted some international experience. I applied for the Peace Corps, and I had no real shot at that. What they were looking for was something very different from what I was then. But I did apply to the Foreign Service, and I made it almost all the way down the hiring process. I made the final 3% cut among the class they were looking at in 1990 and 91. I went to Virginia, to I think Alexandria, and I sat for the last round of interviews and simulations that they did. Unfortunately, I was in the top 3% and they wanted the top 1%. So I had a really fun few days out there at the government's expense, but I also found that I was not going to be hired to be the second blind foreign service officer. I later found out that Mr. Rabi had to actually file a lawsuit and win that lawsuit to get his opportunity.
Right.
So I know that the system were not exactly bought in to blind people doing this on a regular basis. I know there's others that have gotten there since then, and I've met one of them. But that wasn't it for me. But they also said what I really needed was more management experience. I'd never done anything in management. So I decided to go to management school or business school as graduate school. I got accepted by a few different places. I chose Northwestern University in Chicago. My sister had gone through that program. I guess that's maybe one of the reasons I selected that one. I could have gone to a couple of others that also had accepted me. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened had I done that. But I did spend 2 years in Chicagoland, met some of the most impressive people that I've ever met in my life, figured out train systems and paced bus systems and went all over the place and had friends in the city, not just in the school, I made the most of that time. And that's what I did from 1993 to 1995. Unfortunately, I found out you can get an MBA or a Master of Management, but they still weren't hiring a lot of blind people out there. And so while my associates were getting jobs at McKinsey and Company and Booz Allen Hamilton, as it was known at that time, and they were working for Bank of America, doing all kinds of interesting things, and also brand management companies like Nabisco and Kellogg and all that. I got all of one job offer coming out of one of the top 5 B schools in the country, and I took that job offer, which led me to Midland, Michigan, where I knew nobody at that time. But I spent about 3.5 years doing various types of business research for the Dow Chemical Company. And that did not last as a career, but I got a chance to make the first real money I had ever earned. At that time, through another connection that wasn't related to Dow, I happened to meet the woman that I eventually married and am with now and have had 4 kids with. And so that was a whole different kettle of fish. But at the end of 98, I was downsized along with several others in my department. And we decided at that time that entrepreneurship was probably not a bad way to go, or, something that wasn't just strictly speaking corporate. In 2000, I landed in the South Bend, Indiana area, which is where she is from. I had never lived here before. This is where I am now. And while struggling to find a place here, I realized that I could get hired on as what is called a financial advisor. I had no idea what that was. With a business degree, I could probably be a credible hire as a financial advisor. Little did I know that involved telesales in the very beginning. Never thought I was a salesperson either. Since then, I have found out that I have more selling ability than I had ever thought that I might, and that is an honorable profession if you're convincing people to do what is right for themselves. And so I've found that over the years, being what I am enables me to, in a way, keep my own hours. We've chosen the small business sort of independent contracting route rather than the employee channel, working for a bank or for somebody else's brokerage. I get to be a researcher. I get to be a public speaker now and then. And I get to help people problem solve, which is something I would not have had a chance to do on the radio. And when someone comes up to you, as a few people have, and have said, thank you for making it possible for me to retire and to do what I want to do and to spend time with grandkids and to live where I want to live. That's definitely a hit. That's a great feeling to have someone say, thank you for helping me to do and to be what I didn't know I could do or be.
So investing isn't what you had originally planned to do with your life. So I can't say that it was necessarily a lifelong goal from the beginning, but you evolved into it and it seems to be going pretty well for you.
Well, yeah, I think it has. It's investing means different things to different people. To some clients, the goal is, I just don't want to lose money. Please put me in something that earns a little bit, but I don't want the chance for anything I'm in to go down. For others, what investing means is, I want to be more aggressive. I want to build what I have. What do you think about this or that opportunity? What stock should I be in? Because I really want to grab onto an opportunity and seize the day and have as much as I can have at the end of the day. And for still others, it means giving. It means building something up so I can pass it along, either to a charity, to the kids, to the grandkids, to my religious institution of choice, whatever that is. So I find that investing is not just investing. At the root, at the heart of investing, the heartbeat of it is really the people that I serve. And I was told early on, hey, you don't have a practice. All you're doing is practicing unless you have people to be in front of. And So in my mind, and I'm not that much of a quantitative guy. I'm not the person out there working as an actuary for Symetra Life Insurance Company, figuring out how much money has to go in and how much it must earn to be able to give 50,000 people the payouts they want from an annuity till the end of their projected lifespans. That's not where I am. I'm not designing a mutual fund. That's more like what a certified financial analyst would be. I am a certified financial planner practitioner. And what a CFP does is takes numbers that you see and translates those into action steps that I can explain in plain English terms to a client I'm in front of that can give that individual person, family, or small business the kinds of outcomes that they want. So I'm on the retail end of the food chain, and my job is to try to take the numbers that others are generating and boil that down into something that is digestible to the common man and woman that allows them to, we hope, live the way they want.
So I gather from listening to you, though, that you enjoy what you do.
I do, particularly when it works.
Well, there's that.
There are times it gets a little tricky. 2001, 2002. Mm-hmm. I know that you had a very personal experience that vaulted you, Michael, into the realm of the famous or the almost famous on 9/11. I remember what 9/11 was like as a very small-time retail investment person working out of a field office. I was somebody's employee at that point. I was working for American Express, financial advisors. And I remember my life was never in danger in 9/11, but there were a lot of clients that thought their money and their data were in danger, and that the country itself might even be in danger. And so I morphed during that week from being a telemarketing person trying to set appointments with people I'd never met to being a person who was trying to dole out comfort and a feeling of security and solace to people I had met, who the few that I was managing their accounts at that time, calling them and saying, you know what, your money and your data are safe. I'm here. The company that you have your stuff invested with is based in Minneapolis. It's not based in the Twin Towers. The markets are shut down. There will be volatility, but you're not crashing today. Just
well, the other side of it, the other side of that was that during that week after September 11th, there were a lot of people who were working and moving literally heaven and earth, if you will, to bring Wall Street back. And I know I'm working with some of those companies and providing them with the backup equipment, or not so much at the time backup equipment, but the equipment that would be able to read existing tape backups and put that back on computers. And I think it was Morgan Stanley had found an office space sometime during the week after September 11th. And as they describe it, it was the building with a floor the size of a football field. And they scrounged and scavenged and got their providers of equipment, like IBM, to provide them with computers, even taking them from IBM employees' desks to provide enough equipment to be able to set up what was the equivalent to the trading floor that had been in the World Trade Center that was destroyed on September 11th. And literally from Friday afternoon, that would have been the 14th, to the 16th, in 36 hours, they not only reconstructed physically what the trading floor was, but because of what we provided them with, they were able to completely reconstruct what everything looked like on their computers. So when Wall Street reopened on the 17th, everything was like it was when everything shut down on the 11th. Now, I think there's some blessings to the fact that the towers were struck before Wall Street opened, I don't know how much easier that made it. Maybe some, but the reality is that data is backed up regularly, so they would have been able to survive. But the fact that the markets hadn't opened in the U.S. certainly had to help. But by Monday, the 17th, um, they brought Wall Street back just as if nothing had happened. It was a monumental feat to be able to do that.
That is a story that I would love to read because I've never heard that story before. And that makes me feel very unintelligent, Michael. I can't even imagine the logistics and the people and just even the imagination that it would take to reconstruct that. I'm sure it was thousands. I'm sure it was thousands of people. And I'm sure that probably that's something that somebody had thought about even before the 9/11 incident happened. I don't think that was invented out of whole cloth on Friday the 14th, but no. That's a story that would be a very captivating book. And if no one's written it, then gosh, would that be a fun thing to research and write?
Well, the reality is the SEC required that all data from financial institutions had to be backed up and kept available off-site for 7 years. So first of all, the data was all around. And that's why I think it was an especially great blessing that the markets hadn't opened, because all the backups from the previous night and probably from all the, not only the futures, but the sales from foreign markets were pretty much all backed up as well. So everything was backed up. That, of course, was the real key, because getting the hardware, yes, that was a logistical nightmare that they were able to address. Getting the computers, getting everything where they needed it, then companies like ours providing them with the wherewithal to be able to pull the data from the tapes and put it back onto the computers. It had to be quite a feat, but it all worked. And when Wall Street opened, it opened as if nothing had happened, even though some of the offices were now in completely different places across the river, but it all worked.
Incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I knew people from the firms, and of course we helped them by providing them with equipment, but at the same time, hearing about the story later was really quite amazing. And they did a wonderful job to bring all that back. So it was pretty amazing that all that occurred. So that was pretty cool all the way around.
And of course, the other struggle was in 2007, 2008. I remember when I would be sitting at my desk, and I'm not a day trader. I'm a long-term investor. That's what most of my clients want. I'm not in there, trading daily options. I'm not doing inverse leveraged products that have to be bought in the morning and then sold in the afternoon under most cases. But I remember sitting at my desk in 2008 when the Great Recession was going on, when the financial crisis happened, and when banks and huge investment banks, brokerage institutions were in some cases completely failing. That's a whole other story that was chronicled in books like The Big Short, as an example. But I remember sitting at my desk and timing it and watching in a 5-minute period of time as the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which was back in those days was what, maybe 6,000 or so as a benchmark. It was going up and down by a margin of error of 800 points in 5 minutes. It would be 400 up 1 minute and then 400 down from that level. In other words, an 800 point swing within a 5-minute period of time. There was one day I went to take a test because I have continuing education on a pretty regular basis. I had to go to a testing center and take a test that lasted maybe 3 hours. I got back, and I think the market for at least the Dow Jones had dropped by 800 points during the time that I was in the testing center. And that gives you some stomach acid when that sort of thing happens, because even though it's things always bounce back and they always bounce up and down, clients call and they say, oh my gosh, what happens if I lose it all, because people really think that they could lose it all. Now, if you're in a mutual fund with 100 different positions, it's very unlikely that
Right.
all of those positions go to zero. What I found out is that when people's money is concerned, it's emotional.
Yeah, it's
It's
all
not
emotion.
rational. They're not looking at the empirical data. They're thinking fight or flight, and they really are concerned with what in the world am I going to do if I go to zero?
And it's so hard to get people to understand. If you're going to invest in the market, it has to be a long-term approach, because if you don't do that, you can disappoint yourself. But the reality is, over the long term, you're going to be okay. And now today, once again, we're seeing the evidence of that with what the Fed did yesterday, lowering by a half a point, and how that's going to affect everything. But even over the last 5 or 6 years, so many people have been worried about inflation and worried about so many things, because some of our politicians have just tried to scare us rather than dealing with reality. But the fact of the matter is that it all will work out if we're patient and allow things to work. And what we need to do is to try to make wise decisions to minimize perhaps our risk, but still things will work out.
Yeah, I remember, I think the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is what always used to get quoted, at least on the
Yeah.
radio and the television, it was
Oh,
up
yeah.
somewhere in the 11,000 range before the 2008 debacle, and it fell to, I think, 6,400
Right.
was the low that it reached. Now it's over 41,000.
I think it closed up above 42 yesterday. I'm not sure.
It very well may have. So, when you really think about it, if you just stayed in, and it's more complicated than that. One of the problems people have with the market is that when the market crashes, they also may need to get their money out for different unrelated reasons. What if I lost my job as a result of the market crashing? Right? What if there is a need that I have to fulfill, and that money has to come out for me to make a house payment? You don't know that. And so that's the unfortunate part, is that a lot of the academicians don't take into account the real human factor of real people that need to use their money. But if you could stand to hang on and leave it in, it would be worth, what would that be? Like 6 or 7 times more than it was in 2008. But that's not what clients often do. They often want to sell out of fear when things are down, and then wait too long to buy back in when the elevator has already made its way quite a ways up.
Right. I remember once, and I don't remember what the cause was, but Rolls-Royce dropped to $3 a share. And there were some people saying, this is the time to buy it, as it's not going to go away. And those who did have done pretty well.
Bank of America was $3 a share for quite some time. It was technically a penny stock. This is Bank of America, one of the leading financial institutions in the country, which incidentally has a very interesting history. It wasn't born in New York; it was born in the South.
Right.
If you only knew what those trough opportunities were and knew exactly when to buy in, and I'm constantly telling people, look, my goal is not so much to figure out what to buy, but when to buy in. We're trying to buy low and sell high. And just because something did well last year doesn't mean you have to hang on to it. It might mean we want to trim that position a little bit, take some profit, and pick something that doesn't look as attractive or sexy because of last year's lackluster returns, but maybe this year it will, just due to changing conditions. Financial markets run in cycles. And it's not that some things are inherently good or bad. Some things are in favor now. They were not in favor last year, and they might not be in favor, 2 years from now, but they are now. So that's the hard part. You're not supposed to really time the market. We can't predict all these things, but that's why you encourage people to diversify and to have some things that are not correlated with each other in terms of doing well or badly at the same time, so that you can always sometimes be gaining with your left hand while your right hand is struggling a bit.
Hence the need for people who are certified financial planners.
Right.
So there you go. So you got married, what, 27 years ago? And you married someone who was fully sighted, who probably didn't have a whole lot of exposure to blindness and blind people before. How did all that work out? Obviously, it's worked out because you're still married, but what was it like? And was it ever kind of an uncomfortable situation for you guys?
I don't think blindness was, surprisingly enough, I don't think it was super uncomfortable for her. Now, she had not encountered lots of blind people before, maybe not even any before she met me. But I met her, and this is where I had it easy. She didn't have it easy, but I met her through her family. I knew my wife's name is Danica. I knew her brother before I knew her because he and I had been buddies. For a little while, we ended up living in the same town up in Michigan, and it was not here in the South Bend area where she is. But I went home and had a chance to tag along as he was doing some family things and some things with his friends. But my wife has a very interesting father. She has a very interesting dad who is no longer with us. May he rest in peace. No, hello. Sorry, my 9-year-old just made a brief appearance, and she's incorrigible.
You wouldn't have it any other way.
No, there are days when I would, but but I don't. So anyway, I found out some interesting things raising kids as a blind parent too. But her dad did not see really any kind of limitations. When the world around him was racist, he really wasn't. When the world around him was ableist, he really didn't. And one of the things he encouraged me to do, they had a little acreage, Danica's parents did, and he actually asked me one time when it was leaf blowing or leaf storing season. It was in the fall, lots of oak trees, different things there, to drive the garden tractor, as there was a bale full of leaves behind that he was taken to an area where they would eventually be burned up or composted or something. And I did that. He had an old garden tractor with it was gas powered, and it had pedals and steering wheel, and he would literally run around alongside. It didn't go very fast, and tell me kind of when and where to turn. I'm told that I almost crashed into the pit where the basement of the home was one time, but I didn't. So he was one of these people that saw virtually no limitations, encouraged his kids and others to do great things. He didn't have a great feel for people. He would have been an anti-politician. He had trouble remembering your name, but if you were a decent person and treated him right, it didn't matter if you were black, purple, green, blind, deaf, whatever. He saw it as an interesting challenge to teach me how to do things. He taught me how to kayak. He taught me how to cross-country ski. Back in those days before climate change, we actually got quite a bit of snow in the area where I live, even as early as Thanksgiving time in November. And so the first couple of winters that we lived here, we would go to a local park, or even just out in the backyard of where his property was, and ski. Nordic ski, not downhill ski, really, but it was an amazing exercise. It's an amazing feel to be able to do that. And I have no memory, and I had no relatives that were in touch with the true Scandinavian heritage that Ancestry.com says that I have. But the act of doing a little bit of Nordic skiing with him gave me a real feel for what some people go through, because traditionally skiing was a form of transportation in those countries in the winter. You skied to work, you skied to somebody else's house. I thought that was fun and interesting. Now, the last few winters, we haven't gotten enough snow to amount to anything like that, but I still have a pair of skis.
There you go.
that may be something that we do at some point when given the opportunity, or some other place where we have a bit more of a snow base.
Well, I'm sure that some people would be curious to know this. Being blind and doing the work that you do, you probably do you do the same things, but you probably do them in different ways or have different technologies that you use. What's some of the equipment and kind of technologies that you use to perform your job?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm cutting edge. I'm sure there are people who do differently and better than I do. But I do most of my work in a PC based environment. Um, it's a Windows based environment at the present time, because the broker dealers and the other firms that I work through, I'm independent in a way, meaning I pay my own bills and operate out of my own space and have my name of Brolin Wealth Management as a shingle on my door, so to speak. But you never walk alone in this business. And so I chose ultimately a company called the Commonwealth Financial Network to serve as my investment platform and my source of technology and my source of what is called compliance, which means, they are the police walking alongside what I do to make sure that I've documented the advice I've given to people, to make sure that that advice is suitable and that I'm operating according to the law and in the best interest of my clients, and not taking money from them, or, doing phony baloney things to trade into a stock before I recommend that to somebody else. There's a lot of malfeasance that can happen in this type of industry, but all these securities that I sell and all the advice that I given are done so with the blessing of the Commonwealth Financial Network, which is a member of FINRA and SIPC. I just need to point that out here. But they also provide technology, and most of their technology is designed to work in a Windows environment. And so that's typically what I have used. So I use JAWS.
And JAWS is a screen reader that verbalizes what comes across the screen for people who don't know it.
Right. Or puts it into Braille.
Or puts it into Braille.
In the early days of my doing the business, many of the programs that we had to use to design an insurance policy, or to pick investments, or to even monitor investments, were standalone programs that were not based on a web architecture that would be recognizable. And so I was very fortunate that there was money available from the vocational rehab system to bring somebody in from Easter Seals Crossroads here in Indiana to actually write JAWS scripts, workarounds that could help JAWS to know what to pull from the graphics card on the screen or in the system to be able to help me interact. Because otherwise I would have opened up a program, and to me, it would have just been like a blank screen. I wouldn't have been able to see or interact with the data on the screen. Now, with more things being web-based, it's a little easier to do those things. Not always. There are still some programs that are inaccessible, but most of what I do is through the use of Windows 10 or 11, and with the use of JAWS. I do have iDevices. I like Apple devices, the smaller ones. I'm actually speaking to you using an iPad right now, a 6th generation iPad I've had for a while. I have an iPhone, so I can still, look up stock tickers. I can send text messages or emails if I have to using that. But in general, I find that for efficiency's sake, that a computer, a full-on computer, tends to work best, and that I use that more rapidly and with more facility than anything else.
Right.
I use the Kurzweil 1000 system to scan PDFs or sometimes printed documents or books, things like that, into a readable form. I'm trying to just kind of anticipate what other things you may ask about, but I use Office 365 just like anybody else might. I have to use a lot of commonly available programs because the people monitoring my work and even the clients that I interact with still need to, even if they have sight, they need to read an email right after I send it. My assistant has to be able to proof and manipulate a document in a form that she can read, as well as one that I can listen to or use Braille with. I'm a fluent Braille reader and writer. So there are some gizmos that I use, some Braille displays and Braille keyboards and things of that nature. But, most people seem to be under the misconception that a blind guy has to use a special blind computer, which must cost a king's ransom. Not true. If anybody's listening to the program that isn't familiar with 2024 era blindness technology, it's mostly the same as anybody else's, except with the modifications that are needed to make stuff accessible in a non-visual format.
And the reality is that's what it's all about. It's not like it's magically expensive. There are some things that are more expensive that do help, but the reality is that we use the same stuff everyone else uses, just have some things that are a little bit different so that we are able to have the same access that other people do. But at the same time, that's no different than anyone else. Like I point out to people all the time, the electric light bulb is just a reasonable accommodation for light-dependent people anyway. It's just
Right.
that there are a whole lot more people who use it. And so we spend a whole lot more time and money making it available, that is light on demand, to people. But it doesn't change the fact that the issue is still there, that you need that accommodation in order to function. And, that of course leads to, and well, we won't spend a lot of time on it, but you are very involved in the National Federation of the Blind, especially the NFB of Indiana, and you continue to pay it forward. And the NFB has been all about helping people to understand that we're not defined by blindness, we're defined by what we are and who we are, and blindness happens to be a particular characteristic that we share.
Well, and there's a lot of other characteristics that we might not share. As an example, somebody I don't know that he is involved in the NFB as such, but blind. If you're involved in American blind culture and that, you've probably heard of a man named George Wurtzel. He is the brother of the guy that used to be president of the NFB of Michigan affiliate. But I understand that George is very good at things that I am not at all good at. I understand that he almost built his own house from the ground up. His skill is not with computers and email and all this electronic communication that they do today, but he's a master woodworker. He's an artisan. I'm also involved, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. I'm also involved with an organization called Penny Forward, which is, it could be the direction that I ultimately head in even more, because it dovetails with my career. It's financial education and fitness by the blind for the blind. And it was started by a young man named Chris Peterson, who's based in the Twin Cities, who is not an NFB guy. He's actually an ACB guy, but his values are not that much different. And he's been a computer programmer. He's worked for big organizations, and now he's started his own and has made a full-time business out of financial fitness, educational curricula, podcasting, other things that you can subscribe to and buy into. And he's trying to build a community of varied blind people that do all kinds of things and come from all sorts of backgrounds. And in one of the later editions of his podcast, he interviewed a man who's originally from Florida, who founded a company called Serotech that some might be familiar with, Mike Calvo. And Mike came to some of the same conclusions about blindness that you and I have, except that he's much younger. He's from Florida, and he's a Cuban American. He's a Latino whose first language growing up probably was Spanish, and who actually came out of the streets. I mean, he was in gangs and did all kinds of things that were very different from anything I was ever exposed to as a young person. So I think in a lot of ways, we as blind people face the same types of issues, but none of us comes at it from the same vantage point. We're all dealing with maybe some of the same circumstances, but we've gotten there in very many different ways. And so I try to also impose on people, we are all different. We're a cross section. We don't all tie our shoes or cook our meals the same way. We don't want to live in the same environment. We don't want to do the same hobbies. And we don't all have better other senses than sighted people do. I don't know how many times you've heard it. I'd be a very rich man if I had $1 for every time someone said, well, yeah, but being blind, your hearing must be so much better. Your sense of smell must be so much more acute. Well, no, the divine forces in the universe have not just compensated me by making everything else better. What do you do with someone like Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf? There are plenty of people with blindness and also other morbidities or disabilities, or I don't even like disabilities, different abilities, different strengths and weaknesses along with blindness. There are blind people who also happen to be autistic, which could be an advantage to them in some ways, a disadvantage to others. I would like to go beyond the discussion of disability and think of these things and think of me and others as just being differently able, because, what kinds of jobs and roles in life would people that have the characteristic of autism, maybe they are actually better at certain things than a non-autistic person would be. Maybe overall people who live with the characteristic of blindness, it's been told to me as a theory by someone I knew who was very smart, not blind. They really should employ you guys in all kinds of linguistic fields, because you're attuned to listening to language, to reading language, to communicating. And this man, who isn't blind, but who was a member of the NFB as an older guy, said, look, you guys, you write well, you communicate well, you have to speak well because you don't have nonverbal stuff to draw from, to add to your repertoire of information. So you have to be better at some of these other things than most of us are. Well, maybe that's true. So why can't we look at these things as different types of advantage rather than as a dis that you either have to live with or you don't? I think we need to get beyond some of these conceptions that the world has thrown at us.
And I think that's a great way to end this, because disability is not a lack of ability. And we can prove that. But I agree with the things that you are saying, and I appreciate you saying them. I hope that this has been good for people to hear. And I want to thank you for being here to be able to have this discussion. We'll have to continue this and do it again. That'll be kind of fun. And maybe get Danica to join us, and she can talk about you, but that's a different story. So we won't worry about.
She may do that, and she has some stories, but
I'll bet she does.
I'm not going to tell her stories. She has a very different way of framing things, and she's great at a great many things. But what I can tell you about her is that she has never. There are times we've had disagreements in 27 years. Go figure. However, she has never lowered expectations of me, and would have never married me if she felt that she had. I may not be driving the car, but I'm still unloading things from the trunk and loading stuff into the trunk. When we had babies, I was still putting together the baby car seat and loading the baby in it and feeding the baby and giving baths. And the other day she was angry because I was down here trying to work for 10 minutes, sneaking in just a little bit of time to read emails when I was not making sure that the littlest of our kids were doing what she had told them to do. And so I got called in on the carpet. Why are you being an absentee parent tonight? So that's not the words of somebody that would be lowering the expectations of blindness. So she's not interested in the organized blind as a movement, but she definitely wants me to be all I can be and pulling my weight in the relationship and in our life. Well, and I'm glad about that, even if sometimes that leads to some discomfort. What I know is that she at least believes in me to set and maintain those high expectations, and to praise me when I meet them, and to come up with other ways of expressing when I don't.
Well, there you go. Well, again, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank all of you for listening to all of us today. This has been great. I love to hear your comments. Feel free to email me with any thoughts that you have about this or any of our episodes or about the podcast in general. You can reach me at Michael H.I., Michaelhi at Accessibe, ACCESSIBE.com. Or you can go to our podcast page, which is at michaelhinkson.com/podcast. And Michael Hinkson is MichaelHingson.com/podcast. So one way or another, I'd love to hear from you. Wherever you're listening, we would really appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star review. We really value your reviews. We hope that it's 5-star and that you really approve of what we're doing and that you're enjoying listening to all of these episodes. If you know anyone who might be a good guest on Unstoppable Mindset, we'd love to hear from you and we would appreciate an introduction. Kane goes for you as well. We're always looking for guests. So anybody knows anyone, we'd love to hear from you and hear about anyone that you feel ought to become a guest on Unstoppable Mindset. So once again, I want to thank you, Kane, for being here. This has been fun and enjoyable, and we will have to do it again. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I do look forward to coming on at another time when it is convenient for all.